This video is by Straight Goods News. SGNews.ca.
Please proceed.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. We have arrived at a moment unlike any other in the history of our peoples. And I, for one, am deeply grateful to our people, and deeply grateful for the leaders that we have today, both those in positions of elected leadership amongst our nations, and the councils and the chiefs. And I can't overemphasize as well that the leadership of the people, the grassroots, as they are so often referred to. This is the strength of our nations. Through decades of advocacy by our people, by the leaders that we have today, and those who've come before us, we have been unwavering. Generations of our leaders have delivered the same message to successive federal governments for over a century. Governments need to understand that our resolve is absolute as Indigenous peoples of these lands here, and we recognize as well that we are a part of an international, a global Indigenous movement to take our rightful place in our respective territories. From the battle against the destructive federal government white paper back in 1969 to the struggles to win Section 35 in the Constitution in 80, to the Charlottetown debates in the 90s, to our efforts to make effective the recommendations of the Royal Commission 16 years ago, we have never wavered. Our voices have always been clear. Continuing attempts to undermine our resolve to divide our people have and always will fail. Today, our work in preparation for the meeting with the Prime Minister on January 11th, 2013, stands on the shoulder of decades of Indigenous leadership. Our demands are backed by one Supreme Court victory after another. And I myself have experienced in exchanges with the courts as I've battled with my people for our fishing rights to be recognized, sitting there and having a Crown lawyer look at me in my own home territory and say that you, as the Nuu-chah-nulth peoples, with a plural, do not exist as a peoples. And we know what that concept means, both in international law as well as in relation to the relationship that our people struggle with today with Canada. Today, our people are standing up from coast to coast to coast. It's created an opportunity for the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We acknowledge and give thanks to the awareness that has been brought through Idle No More, as well as through the actions of Chief Spence, Elder Robinson, and Jean Sauk. As leaders, our responsibility above all is to care for our peoples, and we have heard their voices. Governments need to understand this will not change. We are absolute in our conviction and in our determination to achieve our rights. We will fulfill our responsibilities to our ancestors and to future generations. Every day that we fail to act means a loss of opportunity for our citizens. Every day wasted means another First Nations child life is wasted. It's time we broke through the paralysis and the endless broken promises, and it's time to act. So let me summarize at the highest level, and our discussions continue with our leaders here. The demands of our people of the First Nations is the need for fundamental transformation in our relationship with the Government of Canada now. That we need real remedies and real change for our people now. And we need action, in particular, for our most vulnerable citizens. Is it appropriate that First Nations rank around 67th on the UN Human Development Index when Canada ranks in the top 7? Is it appropriate that when Amnesty International released a report that said that there's a grave human rights crisis amongst First Nations in Canada, is that appropriate? In 2011, when Sheila Fraser said that after 10 years of audits and over 30 audits specifically on Indian and Northern affairs, that conditions were getting worse, is that appropriate? Around the date when that report was released in December, I attended with a family who we went to the morgue to identify the body of their 16-year-old daughter, who was not just a life from a single family. This is now not only over 600 in a formal sense, but those that provide leadership and support for the murdered and missing Indigenous women of this country suggest that the number is over 2,000. The question is that appropriate? This is what our people are saying, that poverty is killing our people, that the history of colonization and unilateral action on the part of governments will stop now. The movement that is Idle No More is standing up for the waters, for the rivers. They're saying that the unilateral actions that are taking place under Bill C-45 and C-38 are not appropriate. We have a pattern in this country of blaming and finger-pointing. All of us have collected, you and I, and the Prime Minister and First Nations have inherited an Indian Act 100 years old that oversteps the treaty rights and relationship that the Chief just spoke about, and we have yet to find a way to resolve these issues with Canada, as Chief Jody has been talking about. And so the time for that sort of finger-blaming and assassination of characters based on a deeply flawed process, when Auditor General Sheila Fraser, it's important for the international media here to understand, Canada's Auditor General said to the government that there are accountability problems with the federal government's relationship with First Nations. There is no policy to support education. Mainstream Canadians have over 6% increases on an annual basis in education and on in health. Our people for 16 years have been under a 2% cap. We said we would be at a tipping point with the growth of our population exploding, over half under the age of 25. That tipping point is now. We have arrived at the fork in the road. It's got one of two choices. The suggested easy road that people suggest, the tinkering with the Indian Act and the overstepping of treaty rights and the ignoring of the plight of First Nations. Well, you cannot ignore what is happening with Idle No More. And all of us are gripped by what's happening on Victoria Island with those hunger strikers. As I sit here, I'm deeply concerned about not only tomorrow, but I'm deeply concerned about next week and the week after that, and about the relationship between First Nations and Canada. The road that we must take is a difficult one indeed. Is to accept that no longer can we only ask a single question about a single community and the state of affairs of their audit and their finances, but we've got to dig deep and say we're not going to allow this supposed complexity to stop us from transforming the lives of our people in this country, as well as bringing a sense of real reconciliation between First Nations and Canadians. I know you asked one single question, but you can see that your question relates to the broad relationship. That's why the call for fundamental transformation and the call to get back to a nation-to-nation relationship. In essence, what we have is a deep disconnect. We don't have a sense of trust between First Nations and especially the governments. And so I think that the relationship that is required was expressed in treaty, that our children, as it says in Treaty Number 3, which is a northern treaty in Northern Ontario, says that, and it's explicit in Treaty Number 3. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. If I would suggest that we encourage not only Canadians, part of what Idle No More is about educating not only ourselves as First Nations about the rights that we've inherited, but reaching out to Canadians to understand that these rights are real. That Treaty 3 says that your children and my children, now mind you, mine are in their 20s, I don't know how old yours are, but that our children would learn about each other. And so you can imagine that suggests a trustful relationship where we invite one another to learn about ourselves, as opposed to storming in and confronting one another about what is or isn't right or what our perspectives are or are not. The interaction that you're describing, to me, relates directly to the deep disconnect that exists in Canada. And that's why we must invest in the children that you're talking about. Why is it that our children, we have 200 communities that I know need schools right now in Canada. We know that our children are underfunded for education. We also know that our children, through the residential school system, there was an effort to take our language away. The over 50 languages in this country, for our international friends, are in jeopardy of dying. And this should be seen as a great part of the rich heritage of this country. These are the things we need to support our young people so that they can grab hands and they can recognize that they've inherited a deep, dark past of colonialism, and that we will drive the final stake in the heart of colonialism, and it will happen in this generation. Terry Malewski.
Thank you. Almost everything you're saying is contradicted by the Indian Act, you might agree. In fact, a year ago you had a meeting with the Prime Minister and the Governor-General for that matter, and you made a scathing speech, and you called the Indian Act disgraceful and said that if we don't fix it, then no progress is possible, no meaningful relationship is possible. Then the Prime Minister got up and said he has no plan to repeal it, or even to unilaterally rewrite it, and there seems to be a tinkering approach instead. When you meet the Prime Minister tomorrow, Do you intend to insist on your position that the Indian Act must go, or is tinkering with it good enough?
Fundamental transformation and the moment, and particularly the involvement of the citizens, First Nation citizens. Real transformation, in fact, requires the citizens to be fully engaged and pressing for what moving beyond the Indian Act needs to look like. And the Indian Act itself is really the first unilaterally developed, imposed, and implemented piece of legislation. It creates great challenges for our people. You just heard Chief Perry say that we're over 50 nations. Under the Indian Act, there's 633 bands. And we didn't create that system. Governments come to us, well, you're so diverse, you've got 633 leaders, this is really difficult. We'll go back and look in your records. We didn't create that system, you created that system. And so what we require and what we need is both to do the work. Perhaps Chief Jody would like to reflect on that particular aspect because of her deep experience, but the real work in our communities, to reflect on the laws that we've inherited. And this is the connection with bills like C-38 and C-45 that are seeking to overstep our people's rights to be care for the rivers, to care for the land and the environment, and to have a say over resource development. Canada is seeking right now, and we know this unequivocally, to develop over $650 billion in natural resources. One would look at the Indian Act and says, well, there's only influence over a small reserve portion. That's not what the treaties say. And what the treaties have always said, and it's been understood to say, there's a great book written by Dr. Long on Treaty Number 9, which in fact is linked. Chief Spence comes from Treaty Number 9. And I tell that short story because for 100 years there were independent witnesses, and the records have now been found that confirm and corroborate the oral evidence of the First Nations in the area. And it's in direct contradiction to what governments have continually maintained does not exist. And that's a right to their lands, not just the reserves, a right to have a say over what happens in their territories. The translation of that moment now is that the link with C-45 and the link to address moving beyond the Indian Act is to implement the treaty relationship. Move from a policy that the federal government has now of denial and extinguishment to one of recognition and implementation. And here's both the challenge and the opportunity. With $650 billion in natural resources development at stake in Canada's near future, that C-45 was intended, in fact, to unleash and make easier to develop those resources. I and so many others repeatedly said in committees on Parliament Hill that it would, in fact, have the opposite effect, that it would create greater uncertainty, that not addressing the fact that the Indian Act and its legislation does not reflect nor respect the treaty relationship, nor our inherent rights, nor the UN Declaration, means that we must come back together with the Crown in good faith. So that's the press right now, is that the work of moving beyond the Indian Act is about implementing the treaty relationship on a treaty-by-treaty and nation-to-nation relationship. Regional Chief Jody is overseeing negotiations in areas where there are no treaties. And so you're beginning from a place where government has a policy of non-recognition. So as such, they feel that they can go ahead, change legislation like C-45 without implications or ramifications. Well, since the 80s, we've got Section 35 of Canadian Constitution affirms and recognizes our Aboriginal rights and treaty rights. What has been left over from the constitutional talks were promises to get back to talk about implementation. So that's where we are. And the Indian Act does not relate to Section 35. It is not part of the original understanding of treaty. And the vast majority of First Nations, we need to move beyond it. But what you don't do is you don't unilaterally tinker with it, nor do you just suggest on the part of government that they can just pull it out from underneath First Nations. So you need to do this.
Get rid of it.
What I just said, to be perfectly clear, we have lots of pieces of legislation in Parliament that are not enacted. We have, for example, still legislation that alludes to the residential school era that are not enacted. And so what we're talking about is putting in place new arrangements that reflect the original understandings of treaties. And I'd ask my colleagues to further clarify this, because this is helpful to dig into some of this discussion, because it isn't overly simplistic. And the point we're making here now is to not let the complexity stop us from getting on with the work. And that's what we want to compel the Prime Minister and the Crown to come to the table to do. And it must not be just just done with 3 of us. This has to be done with nation to nation. So we, in fact, are advocating for the space to be created for the work to go ahead. I'm always hopeful in considering the hearts and the spirits of people. I'm very hopeful and thankful and grateful and inspired by Idle No More and the power of the people. We have sayings in my language, Tlawa istat, the people will push up against you, and they will push and show the way forward. And they're saying that and expressing very often quite joyfully the resilience through flash mobs and bringing the culture out and expressing frustration with the bills that have been passed, as well as the Indian Act, and as well as the deep poverty, expressing the pain that has been inherited through the residential school era, as well as the deep social ills and the poverty in our communities. And we've been saying that we know that our leaders have been making every effort. I spend time in communities where chiefs essentially say to me, they're confronted with the choice to either turn on the tap for clean drinking water or open a school, or turn the lights on, or put food on the table, or proper clothes on the back. What kinds of choices are those for any of our people, our leaders, or our parents to be making, especially in the northern remote communities? And so this is not new. This has been bubbling for decades now. It's nothing new that I have said in the last 3.5 years in the role of National Chief. It's nothing that former National Chief Phil Fontaine, former National Chief Overd Mercury, or innumerable leaders before them haven't also said. I think what's happened now is that late Chief Dan George said there would come a time when the young people would step forward. And so many said that. So we have over half of our population under the age of 25. They have one foot in the bush with the elders, recalling who they are and keeping their identity and rebuilding the identity and sense of pride about where they come from, learning the languages, learning the teachings, and learning the ceremonies. We have to recall that up until the 50s, our ceremonies were illegal. Our potlatch and powwow system was illegal. You're sent to jail for trying to hold a ceremony for coming of age for our young people. When I put my daughter through it, and the chief got down and washed her feet in front of the whole community to say she is precious, her life is precious. That ceremony was the first one done in over 80, 90 years in my village. And now look at the hundreds, if not thousands, of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls that we have. There's a direct link to this oppressive policies of the past and the rebuilding that's going on. And so those young people have also gone to school. They've gone to school, they've taken their legal training, and they understand what a bill means. They understand that it falls on the heels of attempts in the past like the White Paper of 1969. They understand these efforts to try to take away our collective rights. And what they're saying is that at this moment, this is not going to be acceptable. And they're pushing up against their leaders. And they're recognizing that even between and amongst ourselves, that there are challenges and differences, north-south, on, off reserve, that we have those who grew up with their language and those who didn't. Those who were part of the 60s scoop and were born in Southern California to see a First Nations face, but don't know that they came from a Northern Canadian policy where good numbers of young people were taken out of their homes and sent away. This is the rebuilding that the regional chief is talking about, the recapturing of treaty that Chief Perry's talking about. And we're reaching out to Canadians for whom they have not been supported to understand what we're sharing here. Only recently, and Chief Perry is making, I think, good examples of mandatory education right in the school system in Saskatchewan. I see that happening in Manitoba. And so only through understanding can, I think, we bridge this gap. Leadership, though, needs to be demonstrated at this moment. And this is what we're calling on the Prime Minister at this moment to step forward, demonstrate for the country that we have inherited something none of us created at this juncture, but we can all of us share in doing something about it. And we see a movement amongst Canadians that is unlike we've ever seen as well. We have business and industry leaders saying First Nations must be a partner in the development of resources. First Nations are not opposed to resource development, just not supportive of development at any cost. So you match the booming youth population with the treaty and rights implementation in a fair and responsible way. You connect that with growing interest from the business and industry leaders saying, yes, we need a new resource revenue sharing regime. Then we're talking about supporting First Nations to be lifted out of poverty. because poverty is killing our people right now.
2013 marks the 250th anniversary of the Royal Proclamation, and our people believe strongly in our ceremonies, and we have a strong sense of, I think, unity building, that even though we are diverse, over 50 languages, treaty, non-treaty, north, south, east, west, urban, rural, and different experiences, what's exciting at this moment is First Nations are engaged and are seized by this moment, and the sense of pride that's arise. So if the Crown does not respond, if we don't find that Canadians are joining us and seeking to do the hard work of reconciliation, I am concerned about the safety of our people. I am concerned about the well-being, especially of our most vulnerable. I'm concerned about the deepening poverty in our communities. But I have a lot of hope in our people, and a lot of trust and faith in the wisdom of our people, as well as the inspiration of our young people. So this is, as I said earlier, this is a fork in the road. This is the moment of reckoning and the tipping point that for so long that we've said was coming.